this is a story I wanted to cover last week, and it's about the environment. So we've all, I don't, you probably heard about this already, but I wanted to cover it. UN says climate genocide is coming. It's actually worse than that. So it is actually worse than that. So the Copenhagen, they had the first climate agreement that all the countries were supposed to come together on was the Copenhagen Agreement, and that was trying to keep climate change under 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? Because at 2 degrees Celsius, it's catastrophic. Well, that's what they decided to do in Paris. The Paris Accord was to keep it at 2 degrees, which is already a failure. So that's why it's crazy. But none of the countries are even living up to that anyway, not only the United States because Trump pulled out. But here, let me just say, at 2 degrees, which is what everybody's shooting for, this is our best case scenario. At 2 degrees, the melting of ice sheets will pass a tipping point of collapse. 2 degrees Celsius, which is what the best case scenario right now. Flooding dozens of the world's major cities this century. At that amount of warming, it is estimated that global GDP per capita will be cut by 13%. 400 million more people will suffer from water scarcity, and even in the northern latitudes, heat waves will kill thousands each summer. That's at 2 degrees. And it will be worse at the equatorial band. In India, where many cities now numbering in the many millions would become unlivably hot. There would be 32 times as many extreme heat waves, each lasting 5 times as long and exposing in total 93 times more people. So those are like, my brain can't even take in it. What? The heat waves will last 5 times longer? I don't even, what? I mean, so that means like heat waves for years. That's at 2 degrees. Practically speaking, our absolute best case climate, but this is the best case. This is the best case scenario. That's if we immediately, so to avoid warming of the kind that the IPCC now calls catastrophic, which is 2 degrees, it requires a complete rebuilding of the entire energy infrastructure of the world. I'll read that again. So to get to that, stay in that catastrophe, we need to rebuild the entire energy infrastructure of the world. A thorough reworking of agricultural practices and diet to entirely eliminate carbon emissions from farming. And a battery of cultural changes to the way those of us in the wealthy West at least conduct our lives. And we need to do all that in 2 or possibly 3 decades. Just to let you know, they said we need to get rid of factory farming that produces carbon, meaning meat agriculture. Right now in the United States, you can't even videotape a crime being committed on a factory farm. That's a crime. So when documenting a crime is criminal, you're being ruled by criminals. So we are being ruled by criminals. Our whole culture is criminals. And the only people who are punished by the law are people who aren't rich enough to afford a good lawyer. So poor people. We have the world's biggest penal colony in the United States filled with who? Rich people or poor people? Poor people and minorities. People with no money or power. So that's the best case scenario. And to get the best case scenario, we'd have to completely rebuild the entire energy infrastructure of the world. So my point is, that's not going to happen. We can't even take a picture of factory farming in America. That's how much the criminals have a stranglehold on our culture. So the worst case scenario is 4 degrees by the end of the century. And I'm not even going to bother telling you the horrible things that'll happen at 4 degrees. At 4 degrees, the Earth we get into what they call feedback loops, meaning things start to accelerate the warming. And people like Chris Hedges point out that Venus used to have water on it. Now it's 800 degrees because it goes into one of these feedback loops and heating happens exponentially. Once the polar ice caps melt, which is going to happen, it takes thousands of years to refreeze that. So I'm sure you heard about this report that I'm referencing here that everyone's been talking about. And the reason why people are talking about it is because normally the scientists that at the IPCC who put together the report are very conservative and they don't want to be alarmists so people don't dismiss them. But they've decided to not do that anymore, and they've decided to start being alarmist because it's alarming what's happening. Even our best case scenario is catastrophic. So when you saw this study and you read about it, what anything go through your head, Nellie?
Well, it's just that they're still talking about emissions, and just so much of it is the deforestation and the creation of ocean dead zones because you're eliminating the biomass that absorbs carbon. So that's, what the meat industry does more than any other industry is it takes away the ability to absorb carbon from the atmosphere, and that really needs to be focused on. So perhaps they mention it at a different part of the article, but I doubt it. I find it tends to be overlooked. We would need to do everything they're talking here, but then, really embark on reforestation.
Right.
I don't know if you saw that documentary. It was about the photographer, and he photographed people mining in various places, and I think he was the subject of an essay by was it Susan Sontag or something like that, about how people kind of get off on looking at pictures of suffering around the world. I forget what that was called, and but I'm forgetting all the names of everything. But it was this documentary about a photographer. And is it okay if I give away the ending now?
Sure.
In the ending, he decides to replant this area, and then they go back decades later, and it's a forest again. And it's completely possible. Well, it wasn't that wasn't the name of the documentary, but it was about a photographer. I think it was nominated for an Oscar. But I've got a friend who has a website called Kubu, COO. For carbon, BOO for bamboo. And it talks about how just replanting bamboo, it can be one of the cheapest ways to replant, and how that can help, again, absorb the carbon. Because that's the biggest problem, is we're eliminating the biomass that absorbs carbon. And that is mostly happening through animal agriculture.
Yes. And so I don't want to be too much of a naysayer, or I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but we are not going to rebuild the entire energy infrastructure of the world. We are not going to rework our agricultural practices. We are not going to change our diet entirely. That is not happening, because the way our culture, meaning the Western world, works, and now the Eastern world, is money. Is if it's profitable, it'll get done. If it's not profitable, it will not get done.
Well, that's the whole thing. If people, how animal rights activists cannot see how the two-party system means that they're going to die, and all these same awful things are still going to be happening. I mean, what do you want to achieve in your lifetime? If you vote for candidates who take money from pharmaceutical companies, you're still going to have, bunnies with their heads in stocks, and horrible tests being done to dogs and rats and cats and guinea pigs and all these animals. The universities have a great interest. So many horrific experiments happen in the name of science and knowledge, and actually it's in the name of profit, because there's a lot of money to be made, grant money, and animal research can almost always be repeated because it's so variable, because it's so undependable. I mean, you're dealing with this. It's not just a petri dish. You're dealing with a complex organism, and look how different just the five of us in this room are, and we're all of the same species. But anything each of us would take would vary wildly. And when you're dealing with animals, you're dealing with the fact that most of them are on 4 feet. That affects their circulation. That often doesn't translate to humans. I mean, there's so many things that will kill animals and are fine for humans, that will kill people and are fine for animals. That could be a whole discussion in and of itself. And then when you look at animal agriculture, meat and dairy is subsidized in this country. Why is meat and dairy subsidized in this?
Subsidized.
Yeah, so it's encouraged. Climate change is encouraged, by both sides of the aisle, and a plant-based diet is not encouraged. And there's a reason for both those things. And as you say, it's the money. If you don't get out of the system, the end route is clear.
Okay. I couldn't agree more, which is why when there was a moment in this country to actually have a non-corporate, non-neoliberal party that actually spoke for the people, in order to get that started, you need a charismatic leader who's already popular and can draw other popular politicians to that party. When that moment came, it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And now we see the results of that, right? So now the results of that is a guy like Gillum in Florida, who's a good progressive, now has to bend his knee to the neoliberals and the corporatists who are the problem, right? So now if he wants to be a viable candidate, he has to now bend the knee to the people who are pushing global warming, people like Debbie Wasserman Schultz, people like Bloomberg, like the guy who instituted stop and frisk in New York City. These are the people who now, if you want to be viable in the Democratic Party, you have to bend your knee to these people. It's just the opposite of what we need to be doing. And there is this idea that increment. By the way, incrementalism gets you a black president with a Muslim name who governs like Ronald Reagan. That's what incremental. So voting lesser of two evil. If you start doing that in 1980, by the time you get to 2016, by the time you get to 2008, you get a black guy with a Muslim name who governs as Ronald Reagan. That's his own words. That's what Barack Obama said. He said his policies were moderate Republican. And then 8 years later, it gets you Donald Trump. So when a guy who's supposed to be a lefty governs as a Ronald Reagan, why do you think half the country doesn't vote? Why do you think that is? Again, and then people are still stuck with voter policing. Well, we got to make sure everybody votes blue. We got to make sure. The Democrats right now, if they ran on a platform of ending the wars, Medicare for all, and free college, would sweep back into power. Yet they won't do it. So all your voter policing is wasted energy. And that's all it is. Voter policing. Never before in the history of this country have politicians not been expected to campaign for votes. It only started with Hillary Clinton. She was the first candidate in the history of the world who wasn't expected to garner votes by campaigning. She was just supposed to get your vote. And if you didn't give it to her, you're a bad person. That never happened before. Even when Ralph Nader ran against Al Gore, nobody wagged their finger at the voters. They hated Al Gore. I mean, they hated Ralph Nader. They didn't hate the voters. Please make sure you're subscribed. Even if you think you are subscribed, there's a good chance you're not. So please check. It only takes a second. And then click that bell. And that's how you know you'll get a notice every time we drop a video. They still won't notify you every time we drop a video, but that's the best we can do. Plus, if you like the show, you want to support it, please become a patron. We give you hours of bonus material every week. And come see a live show. Go to jimmydorcomedy.com for our live schedule.